Hey beautiful souls, welcome back to my channel. Before we dive into today's story, I need you to grab some tissues, maybe some wine, hit the subscribe button of this channel, share this story, and definitely buckle up because what I'm about to tell you will leave you absolutely speechless. This is the story of how my sister's perfect fairy tale wedding turned into the ultimate revenge plot that destroyed her cheating husband's entire life in just one night. Now he's the one writing down and only helping her to voice it out. If you're new here, I'm Sarah, and I share real stories about love, betrayal, and finding your strength when life throws you curveballs. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, let me take you back to what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The perfect facade. 3 years. That's how long David and I had been together when he got down on one knee at our favorite restaurant, Chez Laurent, with a ring that could blind you from space. I remember thinking I was the luckiest woman alive. David Harrison, successful businessman, owner of Harrison and Associates marketing firm, devastatingly handsome, and completely devoted to me. Or so I thought. Let me paint you a picture of David. 6'2", dark hair that he spent way too much time styling, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could convince you to invest your life savings in his latest business venture. He drove a Mercedes, lived in a penthouse downtown, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he looked at you. We met at a charity gala 3 years ago. I was working as an event coordinator for the nonprofit hosting the evening, running around in my best dress trying to make sure everything went smoothly. David was there as one of the major donors, and when the microphone failed during the auction, he jumped up and started auctioning items himself with such charisma that he raised 3 times our goal. After the event, he found me packing up decorations and said, "You know, I've been to a lot of fancy parties, but I've never seen someone make organized chaos look so beautiful." Cheesy. Absolutely. Did it work? Like a charm. Our first date was magical. He picked me up in his Mercedes, took me to this little Italian place that wasn't even open to the public yet because he knew the owner, and we talked until 3 in the morning. He told me about growing up with a single mom who worked 3 jobs, how he built his business from nothing, how he wanted to travel the world, and maybe have a family someday. I fell hard. Like embarrassingly hard. The first year was perfect. David was attentive, romantic, surprising me with weekend getaways and flowers just because it was Tuesday. He integrated me into his life seamlessly. I met his business partners, his friends, his mother who lived in Florida. He made me feel like I was his priority, his future, his everything. Year 2 was when Maya entered the picture. Maya Chin, 24 years old, fresh out of business school, with legs that went on for miles and an MBA from Wharton. David hired her as his personal assistant, and from day one, he couldn't stop talking about how brilliant she was, how organized, how she'd revolutionized his entire office system. "Sarah, you should meet Maya," he'd say constantly. "She's incredible. She reorganized my entire filing system, and now I can actually find things. And her ideas for the Johnson account? Pure genius." At first, I thought it was sweet that he was so invested in mentoring young talent. David had always been passionate about his business, and seeing him excited about having someone competent helping him made me happy. I was proud of his success, proud of how he was building something meaningful. Maya was always professional when I met her at company events. Polite, respectful, appropriately distant. She'd shake my hand and say, "Sarah, so nice to see you again. David talks about you constantly." But there was something about the way her eyes lingered on David when she thought no one was looking. Something about how she'd find excuses to touch his arm when showing him documents. Something about how she dressed just a little too well for an assistant's salary. But I pushed those thoughts away. I trusted David completely. He'd never given me a reason not to. The engagement happened 6 months after Maya started working for him. David planned this elaborate proposal during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. He'd coordinated with the hotel, the restaurant, even hired a photographer to capture the moment. When I said yes, tears streaming down my face, he whispered, "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you." Looking back, I wonder if Maya helped him plan it. Planning the wedding was a dream. David insisted we spare no expense. "This is our one wedding, Sarah. I want it to be perfect for you." We booked the Grand Belmore Hotel, the most exclusive venue in the city. The ballroom could hold 300 guests, with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. David was involved in every detail, which I found endearing. He had opinions about the flowers, the menu, the band. "I want this to be perfect," he'd say, squeezing my hand as we met with vendors. "You deserve nothing but the best." My dress was a custom creation. Ivory silk with intricate beadwork, a train that took 3 people to arrange, and a veil that had been in my family for 4 generations. When I tried it on for the final fitting, even the seamstress cried. The guest list was extensive: David's business associates, family friends, college buddies, extended family. Maya's name was on the list as David's +1 for work associates, which made sense since she'd be coordinating some of the business aspects of our honeymoon coverage. 3 weeks before the wedding, I started noticing changes in David. He was working later, taking calls in other rooms, being more protective of his phone. When I asked about it, he'd say, "Just wedding stress, babe. Plus we have this huge client proposal due right after the honeymoon. Maya's helping me get everything organized so we can actually enjoy our trip." 2 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by his office to surprise him with lunch and found Maya there on a Saturday, wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, organizing files with David in a way that seemed unnecessarily close. When they saw me, David jumped up like I'd caught them doing something wrong, then covered with an overly enthusiastic, "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "I brought lunch," I said, holding up the bag from his favorite deli. "But I can see you're busy." "Never too busy for you," David said, kissing me quickly. "Maya was just helping me organize the client files for next week." Maya smiled that polite, professional smile. "I should get going anyway. I have plans this afternoon." After she left, David was off for the rest of the day. Distracted, checking his phone constantly, giving short answers to my questions about final wedding details. 1 week before the wedding, I decided to surprise David by updating his business calendar with our honeymoon dates so nothing could interrupt us. I used his laptop since mine was getting repaired, and when I opened his email to check for any urgent meetings, I saw a message notification from Maya with the subject line, "Tonight was amazing." I hovered over it for about 30 seconds, my heart pounding. This was not like me. I'd never snooped through David's private messages. I trusted him completely. But something in my gut told me to click on it. The email was from the previous night. "David, tonight was amazing. I can't stop thinking about how you made me feel at dinner. I know this is complicated with the wedding next week, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just professional. What we have is real, and I think you feel it too. I'll be thinking about you until I see you tomorrow. M." I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to make it mean something else. Maybe Maya had sent it to the wrong David. Maybe it was about a business dinner that went well. Maybe I was completely misunderstanding the situation. But deep down I knew. I knew with a certainty that made my hands shake and my stomach drop to the floor. I closed the laptop without responding, without leaving any trace that I'd seen the message. I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. My wedding dress was hanging on the back of the door, my veil carefully arranged on its stand, my shoes lined up perfectly underneath. In 1 week, I was supposed to marry the man I loved more than anything. The man who was apparently having an emotional affair, at minimum, with his personal assistant. That night, when David came home, I watched him carefully. He was checking his phone constantly, smiling at messages, then quickly putting it away when he noticed me looking. When I asked how his day was, he said, "Oh, the usual. Maya and I had to work late on the Morrison presentation." He was lying. I could see it in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, the way his voice was just slightly too casual. I had 2 choices. Confront him immediately and potentially destroy our wedding with a week's notice, disappointing hundreds of guests and losing thousands of dollars in deposits, or wait and see what happened. I chose option 3. I started planning. The investigation. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to wake him up and demand answers. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen that email and hope it would all go away. But the part of me that my mother raised to be strong, independent, and never anyone's fool? That part started planning. The next morning, I called my best friend Jessica. "Jess, I need a favor, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm ready to explain everything." Jessica had been my roommate in college, my maid of honor, and the person who'd held my hair back during food poisoning freshman year. If anyone would help me without judgment, it was her. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "I think David might be cheating on me with Maya." Silence. "Sarah, are you sure?" "The wedding is in 6 days." "I know when the wedding is, Jess." That's why I need to be absolutely certain before I do anything. Will you help me? Tell me what you need. Jessica worked in digital marketing and had skills that I definitely didn't. Over the next 5 days, she helped me become a detective in my own relationship. First, we recovered deleted text messages from David's phone when he left it charging in the kitchen. The process involved some technical wizardry that Jessica walked me through, but essentially, we were able to see messages that David thought he'd permanently erased. What we found made my blood run cold. Maya, can't wait until after Saturday. Then we won't have to sneak around anymore. David, I know, baby. Just a few more days of playing the part. Then we can be together for real. Maya, do you think she suspects anything? David, Sarah? No way. She's too trusting. Sometimes I feel bad about how easy this is. Maya, don't feel bad. You're just doing what you have to do. Besides, once you have access to her trust fund after the marriage, you can pay me back for all those business trips to Miami. David, you're right. Just remember, after Saturday night, meet me at the hotel bar around midnight. She'll be exhausted and will go to sleep early. We can celebrate properly then. I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. My trust fund. The money my grandfather had left me that I'd told David about when we got engaged. Money that would become legally accessible to him as my husband. Money I'd planned to use to help him expand his business because I loved him and wanted to support his dreams. Jessica found me on the bathroom floor 20 minutes later, still staring at David's phone in disbelief. Sarah, we're calling off this wedding right now. No. What do you mean no? Sarah, he's using you. They're planning to steal from you and humiliate you on your wedding night. We're stopping this. No, Jess. We're not stopping anything. We're planning something better. I spent the next 4 days learning everything I could about David's business, his finances, and his relationship with Maya. Jessica helped me access public records, business filings, and with some creative social media stalking, Maya's personal information. What I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. David's business was failing. Had been failing for over a year. He'd taken out loans against future revenue that wasn't materializing, and he owed nearly $500,000 to various creditors. The Mercedes? Leased and 3 months behind on payments. The penthouse? He'd been getting eviction notices for 2 months. Maya wasn't just his assistant. She was also an investor who'd loaned him money to keep the business afloat. Money she'd gotten from her wealthy ex-boyfriend, a tech entrepreneur she'd dated and apparently swindled the year before David hired her. They were con artists. Both of them. Maya was the brains, David was the charm, and I was their mark. The plan was simple. Marry me, gain access to my trust fund, use that money to pay off David's debts and fund their next con, then disappear together. They'd probably been planning to divorce me after draining my accounts, claiming irreconcilable differences, and taking half of everything in the settlement. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the naive, trusting little wife who would never question anything. They didn't know that my grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a legacy of being smart about business and never trusting anyone completely with my financial future. The trust fund was real, but it had conditions. Conditions that required both my signature and a waiting period before my husband could access anything. Conditions that Maya and David clearly hadn't researched thoroughly enough. I also discovered something else. Something that gave me an idea for the most poetic justice I could imagine. Maya's ex-boyfriend, the tech entrepreneur she'd swindled, his name was James Morrison. The same Morrison that David's company was supposedly preparing a presentation for. There was no presentation. There was no client. Maya had been using David's business as a front to launder the money she'd stolen from James, and David was too desperate and infatuated to question where her investment money was really coming from. But James Morrison was also someone I could reach. Someone who would be very interested to know where his missing money had gone. Someone who would be very motivated to help me expose Maya and David in the most public, legally devastating way possible. I called James on Thursday. Mr. Morrison, you don't know me, but my name is Sarah Chun, and I believe you've been looking for someone named Maya Chun and approximately $200,000 that went missing from your accounts last year. Who is this? How did you get this number? I'm someone who can help you get your money back and get justice. But I need your help with something first. I explained the situation. James was silent for a long time. You're telling me that the woman who stole from me is planning to steal from you using your fiance as an accomplice, and you want to expose them at your own wedding? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And you want me to be there to witness it. I want you to be there to make sure they face legal consequences. I want you to help me make sure this ends their con artist careers permanently. James agreed. He'd been working with federal investigators trying to track down Maya and his money. Having her location confirmed, along with evidence of her current con, would be exactly what law enforcement needed to arrest her. Friday night, the rehearsal dinner, was the hardest part. Sitting there, toasting to our love, watching David give a speech about how lucky he was to have found his soulmate, pretending I didn't know that everything about our relationship was a lie. Maya was there, of course, playing the perfect professional assistant. She helped coordinate the evening, made sure everyone had drinks, and gave a toast that made me want to scream. To David and Sarah, she said, raising her champagne glass. David, you've taught me so much about dedication, hard work, and going after what you want in life. Sarah, you're getting an incredible man who will stop at nothing to make you happy. Here's to a love that's strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The room erupted in applause. I smiled and nodded and squeezed David's hand like I was supposed to. Inside, I was counting down the hours until I could destroy them both. That night, David held me close in bed and whispered, "I can't wait to marry you tomorrow, Sarah. You're going to make me the happiest man alive." I whispered back, "I can't wait either, David. Tomorrow is going to be unforgettable." He had no idea how right I was. The wedding day. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, mild temperature, gentle breeze. Even the universe seemed to be cooperating with my plan. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I needed to, but because I couldn't sleep. Today was the day I was going to expose the two people who'd tried to destroy my life, and I was surprisingly calm about it. I felt focused, determined, and for the first time in a week, completely in control. David was still asleep beside me, and I took a moment to really look at him. Even knowing what I knew, he was still handsome. Still the man I'd fallen in love with. For just a second, I let myself feel sad about what we could have been if he'd been genuine. Then I remembered the text messages, and the sadness turned back into cold, calculated determination. I slipped out of bed and went to the hotel early. Jessica met me there with coffee and pastries, and we went over the plan one more time. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Sarah? Once we start, there's no going back." "I'm sure." They planned to humiliate me and steal from me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. They deserve everything that's coming to them. The morning preparations were like any other wedding morning, except I felt like an actress playing a role. Hair, makeup, nails, pictures with the bridesmaids. Everyone kept commenting on how calm and radiant I looked. "You're glowing, Sarah," my mother said as she helped me into my dress. "I've never seen a bride look so serene on her wedding morning. I just feel ready, Mom. Really, truly ready for what's coming next." My mother teared up. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become. Strong, smart, and about to marry a wonderful man." I squeezed her hand. "Dad always taught me to stand up for myself and never let anyone take advantage of me. I promise you, I'm going to make him proud today." David texted me around noon. "Can't wait to see you walking down that aisle, beautiful. You're going to be the most stunning bride ever. Love you so much." I texted back, "Love you too. See you at the altar." It wasn't entirely a lie. I did love him, or at least I loved who I thought he was. And I would definitely be seeing him at the altar. James Morrison arrived at the hotel around 2 p.m., along with 2 federal investigators who were posing as wedding guests. I met with them briefly to confirm the plan and make sure everyone knew their roles. "Ms. Chun, are you certain you want to do this during your wedding ceremony?" Agent Rodriguez asked. "We could arrest them privately and spare you the public spectacle." "Agent Rodriguez, they plan to betray me in the most intimate way possible on the most important day of my life. They deserve to be exposed in the most public way possible on the most important day of their downfall." The ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m., followed by cocktail hour, dinner, and dancing. 300 guests, live music, 5-course meal, open bar, and the most expensive cake I'd ever seen. David had insisted on all of it. "Nothing but the best for my bride," he'd said when I worried about the cost. "We only get one wedding, Sarah. I want it to be perfect." Now I knew he'd planned to pay for it with my money after we were married. At 3:30, I took one last look at myself in the bridal suite mirror. I looked perfect. Dress flawless, hair elegant, makeup subtle but gorgeous. I looked like a woman who was about to have the happiest day of her life. "Showtime," I whispered to my reflection. The walk down the aisle was surreal. 300 people standing, classical music playing, flowers everywhere, and David at the altar looking like he was about to cry with happiness. For a moment, seeing his expression, I almost wavered. He looked so genuinely emotional, so truly happy to be marrying me. Then I saw Maya in the third row, wearing a navy dress that was just slightly too sexy for a wedding, watching David with a possessive look that she didn't bother to hide. My resolve hardened. The ceremony proceeded normally through the opening remarks, the reading, and the vows. David went first, and I have to give him credit. His acting was Oscar-worthy. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, 3 years ago you walked into my life and changed everything. You made me want to be a better man, a more honest man, a man worthy of your love. You've supported my dreams, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and shown me what true partnership looks like. Today, I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and be faithful to you for the rest of my life. You are my heart, my home, and my future." The crowd sighed appreciatively. I saw my mother wiping away tears. Then it was my turn. "David," I began, my voice steady and clear. "When we met 3 years ago, I thought I had found my soulmate. Someone who would love me unconditionally, be honest with me always, and build a life with me based on trust and respect." David smiled, his eyes full of love and anticipation. "Over the past few days, I've learned some things about you that have really opened my eyes to who you truly are as a person." His smile faltered slightly. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was off. "I've learned about your business troubles, your relationship with Maya, and your plans for our marriage and my trust fund." David's face went white. Maya sat up straighter in her seat. "I've learned that you've been lying to me, manipulating me, and planning to steal from me from the moment you proposed." Gasps erupted from the crowd. David started to say something, but I held up my hand. "So today, David, I promise to love myself enough to never let you deceive me again. I promise to honor my own worth by refusing to bind myself to someone who sees me as a mark rather than a partner. And I promise to be faithful to my own values by making sure that you and Maya face the consequences of your actions." I turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to inform you that there will be no wedding today. Instead, you're about to witness the arrest of 2 con artists who thought they could steal from me and humiliate me on my wedding day." Complete chaos erupted. David lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "Sarah, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? This is our wedding." "No, David. This is your reckoning." Agent Rodriguez and Agent Kim stood up from their seats in the crowd, showing their badges. "David Harrison and Maya Chen, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and grand theft." Maya bolted from her seat, trying to run toward the exit, but James Morrison was waiting there. "Going somewhere, Maya? You still owe me $200,000. The next 30 minutes were absolute pandemonium. David was screaming that this was all a misunderstanding, that he loved me, that Maya had seduced him and convinced him to go along with her plan. Maya was claiming she was just David's employee and had no idea what he was talking about. Both of them were begging me to stop this, to think about what I was doing. My mother was crying. David's mother was having what appeared to be a panic attack, and most of the guests were recording everything on their phones. But you know what? I felt amazing. For the first time in a week, I felt like myself again. Strong, intelligent, and completely in control of my own life. As the federal agents led David and Maya away in handcuffs, David turned back to me one last time. "Sarah, please. I do love you. I know I made mistakes, but I love you. Don't do this to us." I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "David, if you had actually loved me, you never would have been able to do what you did. Real love doesn't plan to betray and steal from the person they claim to care about." And then they were gone. The aftermath and revelation. After David and Maya were arrested, the Grand Belmore Hotel ballroom fell into stunned silence. 300 guests stood frozen, phones still recording, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The string quartet had stopped playing mid-song. Even the photographers looked confused about whether they should keep taking pictures. I stood at the altar in my beautiful wedding dress, holding the bouquet I was supposed to toss later, feeling oddly calm considering I'd just had my fiance arrested at our own wedding ceremony. My mother was the first to break the silence. "Sarah Elizabeth Chun, what in God's name is happening here?" I took a deep breath and turned to address the crowd. "I know you all have questions, and I promise I'll explain everything. But first, I think we should move to the reception hall. We paid for an incredible dinner, and I'm not about to let David's crimes ruin a perfectly good meal. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Jessica stepped forward and took my arm. Are you sure about this, Sarah? We can send everyone home. Absolutely not. These people took time out of their lives to celebrate with me. The least I can do is feed them and tell them a story they'll never forget. And that's how my wedding reception became the most unconventional dinner party in the history of the Grand Belmore Hotel. As guests made their way to the reception hall, buzzing with questions and speculation, I asked the hotel manager to set up the microphone system. I was going to tell this story properly. James Morrison approached me as I was checking the sound system. Ms. Chun, I have to say, that was the most spectacular takedown I've ever witnessed. Maya looked like she'd seen a ghost when she realized her con was over. Thank you for helping me, James. I couldn't have done this without you. Actually, there's something else you should know. Something the federal agents discovered during their investigation that I think you'll find interesting. More secrets. This one's different. Maya and David weren't just planning to con you out of your trust fund. They've been running the same scam for 3 years, across 5 different states. You're victim number 6. My blood ran cold. 6. There have been 5 other women. All wealthy, all trusting, all completely destroyed by the experience. 2 of them attempted suicide after Maya and David disappeared with their money. Another one lost her family business that had been in her family for 4 generations. I sank into a chair, the full weight of what I'd uncovered hitting me. How many people did they hurt? Too many. But Sarah, what you did today didn't just save yourself. It ended their ability to hurt anyone else. The evidence we gathered from your situation gave us everything we needed to connect them to the other cases. They're going to prison for a very long time. As guests settled into the reception hall, I realized I wasn't just telling the story of my own betrayal. I was telling the story of justice for women I'd never met, women who'd suffered at the hands of the same con artists who'd tried to destroy me. The hotel staff, bless them, continued serving dinner as if nothing unusual had happened. The servers were clearly confused but professional, setting out the 5-course meal David and I had planned together months ago. I stood up at the head table, tapped my champagne glass with a fork, and waited for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, thank you for staying. I know this isn't exactly what you expected when you RSVP'd to a wedding, but I promise you're about to hear a story that will stay with you for the rest of your lives. First, I want to apologize to those of you who traveled long distances to be here, especially David's family members who had no idea what kind of person he really was. None of this is your fault, and I'm sorry you had to find out this way. David's mother, Margaret, raised her hand tentatively. Sarah, dear, I'm so confused. David has always been such a good boy. Are you sure there hasn't been some kind of misunderstanding? I felt genuinely sad for her. Margaret was a sweet woman who'd raised David alone after his father died, working multiple jobs to give him opportunities. Finding out her son was a career criminal who preyed on innocent women was going to devastate her. Margaret, I'm going to show everyone exactly what David and Maya were planning, and you'll be able to see for yourself that this wasn't a misunderstanding. I had prepared for this moment. Jessica helped me set up a laptop connected to the room's projection system, and I began showing the evidence we'd gathered over the past week. First, the text messages between David and Maya discussing their plan to steal my trust fund money. The crowd gasped as I read Maya's message. Once you have access to her money after the marriage, you can pay me back for all those business trips to Miami. Then, the business records showing David's company was failing and he owed nearly $500,000 to creditors. Next, the evidence of Maya's previous cons, including photos of her with her other victims and documentation of the money she'd stolen. But the revelation that shocked everyone the most was when I showed them the timeline. This relationship was never real, I explained, clicking through a detailed chronology Jessica had helped me create. David met Maya 8 months before he met me. They were already partners when he approached me at the charity gala. Everything, our first date, the proposal, the wedding planning, it was all part of their con. I showed them rental records proving David had hired actors to play his business associates at early events we attended together, making his company seem more successful than it was. I showed them credit card records revealing that Maya had been paying for many of David's romantic gestures. The weekend getaways, the expensive dinners, even my engagement ring. The man I fell in love with never existed, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion I was feeling. He was a character they created to manipulate me. Every conversation, every kiss, Every I love you was calculated to make me trust him enough to give him access to my inheritance. The room was absolutely silent. You could hear the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic, but nobody was even breathing loudly. My college roommate Emma stood up. "Sarah, how did you find all this out? And how did you stay calm enough to plan, whatever this was?" I smiled for the first time all day. That's where the story gets interesting. I told them about finding the email, about the week of investigation, about discovering that Maya and David were part of a larger criminal operation that had hurt multiple women across multiple states. But here's the thing, I continued. I didn't just want to stop them from stealing from me. I wanted to stop them from ever hurting anyone else the way they'd hurt their previous victims. And I wanted to do it in a way that would ensure they faced real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist. I explained how I'd worked with James Morrison and federal investigators to gather evidence, how we'd planned the public arrest to ensure maximum exposure and prevent David and Maya from disappearing before they could be prosecuted. The reason I did this so publicly, I said, is because con artists like David and Maya rely on shame and secrecy. Their victims are usually too embarrassed to come forward, too isolated to seek help. I wanted other victims to see that it's possible to fight back, and I wanted potential future victims to know what warning signs to watch for. My mother stood up, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, I'm so proud of you. Your father always said you were the strongest person he knew, and today you proved him right." The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping, then building until the entire room was on their feet, giving me a standing ovation. I started crying then, for the first time all day, overwhelmed by the support and love surrounding me. But I wasn't finished with my story yet. "There's one more thing," I said as the applause died down. "Something I discovered yesterday that I think you'll all find very interesting." I clicked to the final slide of my presentation. David's real name isn't David Harrison. It's David Mitchell, and he's been married twice before. Both wives were wealthy women who lost everything to him and Maya's cons. Both marriages ended in divorces where David claimed emotional distress and walked away with half of everything. Gasps erupted around the room. Margaret Harrison, who apparently wasn't even David's real mother, just another victim he'd used for his cover story, collapsed back into her chair. "The woman you met as David's mother, Margaret, is actually a professional actress Maya hired to play the role. The real David Mitchell's mother died when he was 12, and he grew up in foster care. Everything about his background, his family, his business success, it was all fabricated." The room erupted in shocked conversations. People were turning to each other, processing this information, realizing how elaborate and heartless this con had been. Jessica stood up and started clapping again. "Sarah Chun, you are officially the most badass woman I have ever met." More applause, this time mixed with laughter and expressions of amazement. But wait, there's more to this story, and it gets even better. The real revenge begins. As the dinner progressed and guests began to relax into what had become the most memorable party any of us had ever attended, I realized that exposing David and Maya was only the beginning. The real revenge was going to be what I did with the rest of my life. But first, I had one more surprise for everyone. "Before we get to dessert," I announced, standing up again, "I have some news that I think will make this evening even more interesting." I clicked the remote for the projection system one more time, and a new slide appeared. The Sarah Chin Foundation for Fraud Victims. This morning, while getting ready for what I thought was going to be my wedding, I made a decision. I'm using my trust fund, the money David and Maya were trying to steal, to start a non-profit organization that helps victims of romantic cons and provides resources for people to protect themselves from financial predators. The room erupted in applause again, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. James Morrison, the gentleman who helped me expose Maya today, has agreed to be our first major donor. He's contributing the $200,000 Maya stole from him, plus matching funds, to help us get started. James stood up and waved to the crowd. "It's the best use of that money I can imagine." "But that's not all," I continued, feeling the energy in the room building to something electric. "I've been in contact with the 5 other women David and Maya conned over the past 3 years. 3 of them are here tonight." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd as I gestured to 3 women I'd quietly invited during the week. Women who'd flown in from different states to witness David and Maya's downfall. "Ladies, would you like to introduce yourselves?" A elegant woman in her 50s stood up first. "My name is Patricia Williams. David married me 2 years ago in Phoenix, Arizona. He and Maya took $400,000 from me and destroyed my late husband's construction business. I thought I'd never get justice. A younger woman, probably in her early 30s, stood next. I'm Jennifer Park. They got me in Seattle 18 months ago. $300,000 and my grandfather's antique shop. I've been working with federal investigators ever since, hoping to find them. The third woman was about my age, with short red hair and fierce eyes. Rebecca Stone from Denver. They took $250,000 from me and left me so broken I didn't leave my apartment for 6 months. But I'm here now, and seeing them in handcuffs was better than any therapy. The room was completely silent, absorbing the magnitude of what these women had survived. Together, I said, we're going to make sure David and Maya not only go to prison, but that their story serves as a warning to other potential predators. We're turning our pain into power and our trauma into justice for others. The applause this time was deafening. People were crying, cheering, and several guests rushed forward to hug the other victims and offer support. But I still wasn't done. There's one more thing, I said, waiting for quiet again. Something I discovered yesterday that's going to make David's prison sentence much longer than he's expecting. I clicked to another slide showing bank records and wire transfer documentation. Maya and David weren't just stealing from their romantic victims. They were running a complex money laundering operation using David's fake business as a front. They were washing money for several criminal organizations, including a drug trafficking ring based in Miami. Agent Rodriguez, who had stayed for dinner after processing David and Maya's arrests, nodded grimly. We've been tracking that organization for 2 years. The evidence Ms. Chun helped us gather will allow us to shut down their entire operation. Which means, I continued, David and Maya aren't just facing fraud charges. They're facing federal racketeering charges, conspiracy charges, and money laundering charges that carry sentences of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. The satisfaction I felt saying those words was indescribable. David had planned to steal my money and disappear with his lover, leaving me devastated and financially ruined. Instead, he was going to spend the next few decades in prison, and Maya would be right there with him. But the best part, I said, grinning now, is what happens to all the assets they tried to hide from their victims. I clicked to the final slide, a list of properties, bank accounts, cars, jewelry, and investments that federal investigators had seized as evidence. Everything they bought with stolen money gets liquidated and distributed back to their victims. Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the other women they hurt are going to get their money back, plus interest, plus damages. The 3 women were openly sobbing now, clutching each other in disbelief. Patricia Williams spoke through her tears. Sarah, I never thought I'd see a penny of that money again. My husband's business meant everything to him, and they destroyed it, being able to rebuild it in his memory. I can't thank you enough. That's when I started crying again too. This whole week, I'd been focused on my own anger and betrayal. But seeing these women, seeing how much healing and hope I could offer them by refusing to be a victim, made everything worth it. The dinner continued with an energy unlike any wedding reception I'd ever been to. Guests were mingling with the fraud victims, offering support and asking how they could contribute to the foundation. People were sharing stories of their own close calls with scammers, creating an impromptu support network. My mother approached me as I was talking with Rebecca about her experience recovering from financial trauma. Sarah, I need to tell you something. When your father was dying, he made me promise to raise you to be strong enough to handle anything life threw at you. I was so worried that maybe I'd made you too independent, too suspicious of people's motives. But today, seeing what you've accomplished, I realize he was preparing you for exactly this moment. I hugged her tightly. Dad always said that the most dangerous people are the ones who use love as a weapon. I guess I finally understood what he meant. As the evening wound down, Jessica found me on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the city lights. So, she said, handing me a glass of champagne, how does it feel to be the woman who turned her own wedding into the downfall of a criminal enterprise? I thought about it for a moment. It feels like the best plot twist of my life. Any regrets? About David? No. About Maya? Definitely not. About doing it so publicly? Not for a second. I paused, sipping the champagne. The only thing I regret is that I wasted 3 years of my life believing in someone who was never real. But think about it this way, Jessica said. If you hadn't gone through all of that, you wouldn't have been in position to stop them from hurting more people. Maybe those 3 years weren't wasted. Maybe they were preparation. Around midnight, as the last guests were leaving, Agent Rodriguez approached me with an update. "Ms. Chun, I wanted to let you know that David and Maya are both talking, trying to make deals. They're giving us information about other criminal operations they were connected to. Your case is going to help us shut down a network of con artists and money launderers that spans multiple states." What kind of sentences are they looking at? With the charges we can prove, and considering they're cooperating with ongoing investigations, David is looking at 15 to 20 years. Maya, as the ringleader, is looking at 25 to life. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Good. And the other victims will get their money back. Every penny we can recover, plus punitive damages. The federal government takes financial crimes very seriously, especially when they involve this level of organization and harm to victims. As I changed out of my wedding dress for the last time, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I thought I was about to marry my soulmate and start the perfect life. Tonight, I was the founder of a nonprofit organization, a federal witness in a major criminal case, and somehow, despite everything, happier than I'd been in months. The dress that was supposed to represent the beginning of my married life was now the costume I'd worn while orchestrating the downfall of 2 career criminals. I carefully hung it in the hotel closet, knowing I'd never wear it again, but also knowing I'd never forget what it represented. The day I chose justice over heartbreak, strength over victimhood, and truth over comfortable lies. The trial and ultimate justice. 3 months after the wedding that wasn't, I found myself sitting in a federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, wearing a navy blue suit and preparing to testify against the man I'd once planned to spend my life with. The months between the arrest and the trial had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal preparation, and the most rewarding work of my life. The Sarah Chin Foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations, with donations pouring in from people who'd heard our story and wanted to help protect others from similar cons. We'd already helped 43 victims of romance scams recover stolen funds, provided legal assistance to 12 families dealing with financial fraud, and created an online resource center that had been accessed by over 100,000 people seeking information about protecting themselves from predators. But today wasn't about the foundation. Today was about making sure David Mitchell and Maya Chin paid for their crimes. I looked across the courtroom at David, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. He'd lost weight during his time in jail, and his once perfect hair was growing out, showing gray roots he'd apparently been dyeing. He looked older, smaller, and completely different from the confident businessman who'd proposed to me with such charm and conviction. Maya sat beside him, also in prison attire, looking defiant and angry. Unlike David, who seemed broken and defeated, Maya still carried herself with the arrogance of someone who believed she was smarter than everyone else in the room. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had prepared me well for this moment. Over the past 3 months, I'd spent countless hours reviewing evidence, giving depositions, and preparing for cross-examination. "Ms. Chun," she told me during our final prep session, "your testimony is going to be the keystone of this case. Not just because of what David and Maya did to you, but because you have evidence and documentation that ties together all of their criminal activities. You're not just a victim, you're the person who solved the puzzle." When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand with my head high. I'd been dreading this moment and looking forward to it in equal measure. Dreading it because I'd have to relive the pain of discovering David's betrayal. Looking forward to it because I'd finally get to tell the complete truth about what these people had done, not just to me, but to so many others. ADA Walsh began with basic questions: my name, my background, how I met David. Then we got to the heart of the matter. "Ms. Chun, can you tell the court about the discovery you made 1 week before your planned wedding?" I took a deep breath and began the story I'd told dozens of times to investigators, but never in front of David himself. I was using my fiance's laptop to update his business calendar with our honeymoon dates. When I opened his email to check for urgent meetings, I saw a message from Maya Chun with the subject line, "Tonight was amazing." What did you do when you saw that message? I opened it. The message made it clear that David and Maya were having an affair, and that Maya knew about our wedding but believed their relationship would continue after David and I were married. What was your reaction to discovering this information? Initially, I was devastated, but as I processed what I'd learned, I realized that I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I made any decisions about how to respond. Ada Walsh led me through the investigation Jessica and I had conducted. The recovered text messages, the business records, the discovery of Maya's criminal history, and the other victims. Ms. Chun, at what point did you decide to contact federal authorities rather than simply confronting the defendants or calling off the wedding? When I realized this wasn't just about infidelity or even financial fraud against me personally. When I discovered there were multiple other victims, and that David and Maya were part of a larger criminal operation, I knew this needed to be handled by law enforcement. Did you consider calling off the wedding and handling the situation privately? I considered it briefly, but I realized that if I confronted them privately, they would likely disappear before facing any consequences. They'd done exactly that with their previous victims. I wanted to make sure they were held accountable, and I wanted other victims to see that it was possible to fight back. Ada Walsh then showed the jury the evidence I'd helped gather. The text messages, the financial records, the timeline of David and Maya's relationship, the documentation of their previous cons. Ms. Chun, in your investigation, did you discover the true nature of David Mitchell's feelings toward you? This was the question I'd been dreading most. Yes, I discovered that David never had genuine feelings for me. Our entire relationship was a calculated con designed to gain access to my trust fund. Maya and David discussed me in their text messages as a mark and referred to manipulating my emotions as playing the part. How did that discovery affect you? It was devastating to realize that someone I loved and trusted completely had never seen me as anything more than a source of money to steal. But it also made me determined to ensure that they couldn't do the same thing to anyone else. The cross-examination was brutal. David's attorney, a sleazy-looking man named Richard Crane, tried to paint me as a vindictive woman who'd orchestrated an elaborate setup because I was angry about my fiance's affair. Ms. Chun, isn't it true that you could have simply called off the wedding when you discovered Mr. Mitchell's infidelity? Why did you feel the need to create such an elaborate public spectacle? Because, Mr. Crane, your client and Ms. Chun weren't just having an affair. They were career criminals who had stolen over $1 million from multiple victims and destroyed countless lives. A private confrontation wouldn't have stopped them from hurting more people. But you admit that you planned and orchestrated Mr. Mitchell's public humiliation? I planned and orchestrated the exposure of a criminal conspiracy. If Mr. Mitchell feels humiliated by having his crimes revealed publicly, that's a consequence of his choices, not my actions. Crane tried several times to rattle me, suggesting I was lying about evidence, that I was seeking attention, that I was motivated by revenge rather than justice. But I'd spent 3 months preparing for this, and I wasn't going to let David's lawyer make me the villain in this story. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when Ada Walsh asked me to address the impact of David and Maya's crimes. Ms. Chun, can you tell the court about the other victims you've met through this process? I've now met all 5 of the women David and Maya targeted before me. Patricia Williams lost her late husband's construction business and $400,000. Jennifer Park lost her grandfather's antique shop and her entire life savings. Rebecca Stone became so depressed after they stole from her that she didn't leave her apartment for 6 months and required psychiatric treatment. My voice broke slightly as I continued. These aren't just financial crimes. David and Maya weaponized love and trust to destroy people's lives. They didn't just steal money. They stole their victims' ability to trust, to love, to believe in their own judgment. Some of their victims needed years of therapy to recover from the psychological damage. And what about the broader impact of their criminal organization? Through their money laundering activities, David and Maya were helping drug traffickers, human trafficking operations, and other violent criminals move money and avoid detection. Their crimes went far beyond what they did to their romantic victims. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt emotionally drained but also relieved. I'd told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Patricia, Jennifer, and Rebecca all testified about their experiences with David and Maya. Federal agents testified about the money laundering operation and the other criminal enterprises David and Maya had been connected to. Financial experts testified about the sophisticated methods they'd used to hide and move stolen money. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when David took the stand in his own defense. His attorney had apparently convinced him that showing remorse and claiming Maya had manipulated him was his best chance at a reduced sentence. It was a strategy that backfired spectacularly. "Mr. Mitchell," his attorney began, "can you tell the court about your relationship with Ms. Chin?" David looked directly at Maya as he answered, and I saw her face harden with rage. Maya was the mastermind of everything. She approached me when my business was failing and convinced me that conning wealthy women was our only option. She planned every detail of how to manipulate Sarah and the other victims. Maya's attorney immediately objected, but the damage was done. David continued, painting himself as Maya's victim and claiming he'd developed genuine feelings for me despite the con. "I know what we did was wrong, but I want Sarah to know that my feelings for her became real. Maya threatened to expose my business failures if I didn't go through with the plan, but by the time of our wedding, I was planning to confess everything to Sarah and try to make it right. It was a lie, and everyone in the courtroom knew it." The text messages between David and Maya from the morning of our wedding made it clear that he was fully committed to their plan and looking forward to celebrating with Maya after stealing my money. Maya's reaction to David's betrayal was pure fury. When her attorney called her to testify, she decided to take David down with her. "David Mitchell is a pathological liar," she told the court. "Every word he just spoke was calculated to save his own skin. He was a full partner in everything we did. He planned the cons, he researched the victims, and he enjoyed every minute of manipulating these women." Maya then proceeded to detail David's involvement in their other crimes, including the money laundering operation and connections to violent criminal organizations that the prosecution hadn't even known about. "David wasn't my victim," Maya said coldly. "He was my equal partner, and in some cases he was more ruthless than I was. He suggested we target Sarah specifically because he'd researched her family and knew she had a large inheritance. He called her the perfect mark because she was trusting and had no family members who might interfere with our plans." By the time Maya finished testifying, she'd implicated David in crimes that could add another decade to his sentence. Their partnership in crime had become a betrayal of each other that was almost as dramatic as their betrayal of their victims. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. David Mitchell was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Maya Chin was sentenced to 30 years to life. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to their victims, plus punitive damages, plus the costs of the federal investigation. As the judge read the sentences, I felt a profound sense of closure. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the other women whose lives David and Maya had destroyed. But the most satisfying moment came as David was being led away in shackles. He turned to look at me one final time, and I saw in his eyes the same look I'd seen in Maya's throughout the trial. The look of someone who'd finally been outsmarted by one of their intended victims. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't need to. My presence in that courtroom, healthy and strong and surrounded by the other women we'd helped, said everything that needed to be said. The transformation. 1 year after the trial, I stood in the ballroom of the Grand Belmore Hotel, the same room where I'd exposed David and Maya's crimes, preparing for the Sarah Chin Foundation's first annual gala. The irony wasn't lost on me. The space that had witnessed the destruction of my wedding day was now hosting a celebration of everything I'd built from the ashes of that betrayal. The ballroom looked completely different than it had on my wedding day. Instead of white and gold decorations, we'd chosen silver and blue, colors representing hope and renewal. Instead of round tables for wedding guests, we had a stage, auction displays, and informational booths about financial fraud prevention. Over 300 people were attending, including law enforcement officials, fraud prevention experts, therapists who specialized in helping victims of financial crimes, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by romance scams and other financial predators. But the guests I was most proud to see were Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the other women who'd survived David and Maya's crimes. They weren't just attending as victims. They were speakers, advocates, and leaders in the movement to protect others from the kind of trauma we'd experienced. "Sarah, are you ready for this?" Jessica asked, adjusting my dress. I was wearing navy blue silk, elegant but strong, nothing like the vulnerable white gown I'd worn when I thought I was marrying David. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The evening began with a video presentation showing the Foundation's work over the past year. We'd helped 127 victims of financial fraud recover stolen funds. We'd provided free legal assistance to 89 families dealing with romance scams. Our online resources had been accessed by over 300,000 people seeking information about protecting themselves from predators. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact was in the individual lives we'd changed. Patricia Williams took the stage first, representing all the victims who'd found healing through our work. 15 months ago, I was broken, she said, her voice strong and clear. David Mitchell and Maya Chun had stolen my money, destroyed my late husband's business, and left me feeling like a fool for trusting them. I didn't think I'd ever recover financially or emotionally. She gestured to the audience. Today, I'm the owner of Williams Construction Company, rebuilt from the ground up with the money we recovered from those criminals. More importantly, I'm here to tell other victims that healing is possible, justice is possible, and you don't have to face this alone. The applause was thunderous. Patricia had become one of our most effective advocates, traveling the country to speak at conferences about financial fraud prevention. Jennifer Park spoke next, sharing how the foundation had helped her not only recover her grandfather's antique shop, but expand it into a thriving online business. Sarah taught me that being a victim of a crime doesn't mean you have to remain a victim forever, Jennifer said. We can choose to transform our pain into power and our trauma into a tool for helping others. Rebecca Stone's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The woman who'd been too depressed to leave her apartment after David and Maya's con had become a certified victim advocate and was now working with the FBI to help identify and investigate romance scam operations. These criminals count on our shame, our isolation, and our silence, Rebecca told the audience. When we speak up, when we support each other, when we refuse to be silently victimized, we take away their power. Then it was my turn to speak. I looked out at the audience, law enforcement officers, legal professionals, therapists, journalists, and dozens of fraud survivors, and felt overwhelmed by how much had changed since I'd stood in this same spot a year ago. Last year, in this very room, I thought my life was ending, I began. I'd discovered that the man I loved was a criminal who'd been planning to steal from me and disappear with his partner. I felt stupid, betrayed, and completely alone. But what I learned that day, what you've all helped me understand over this past year, is that being targeted by predators isn't a sign of weakness or naivety. It's often a sign that you're a good person with valuable qualities that criminals want to exploit. David and Maya targeted me because I was trusting, generous, and financially stable. They targeted Patricia because she was loyal and had built something valuable. They targeted Jennifer because she was caring and had inherited something precious. They targeted Rebecca because she was kind and had saved money for her future. These weren't character flaws. They were strengths that criminals perverted for their own gain. I clicked to a slide showing statistics about financial fraud in America. Every year, romance scams alone cost Americans over $300 million. But the financial cost is only part of the damage. These crimes destroy people's ability to trust, to love, to believe in their own judgment. They isolate victims and make them feel responsible for crimes committed against them. The Sarah Chin Foundation exists to change that narrative. We exist to tell victims that it's not your fault, you're not alone, and recovery is possible. We exist to educate people about protecting themselves without becoming cynical about love and relationships. And we exist to make sure criminals like David and Maya face consequences that prevent them from hurting more people. I clicked to another slide showing photos of David and Maya in their prison uniforms. David Mitchell is currently serving year 2 of his 22-year sentence. Maya Chun is serving year 2 of her 30-year-to-life sentence. Both are in federal maximum security facilities, and both have been ordered to pay full restitution to their victims. The applause was immediate and sustained. Even a year later, people found satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served. But the real victory isn't their imprisonment, I continued as the applause died down. The real victory is what we've built from the wreckage of their crimes. Every victim we've helped, every person we've educated, every family we've protected from falling prey to similar scams. That's our revenge against the people who tried to destroy us. I clicked to the final slide, a photo of all the fraud survivors who are now working as advocates, speakers, and counselors. We've taken the worst experience of our lives and transformed it into the foundation for helping others. We've taken our pain and turned it into purpose. We've taken our trauma and turned it into triumph. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. After my speech, we held a silent auction featuring items donated by local businesses and celebrities who supported our cause. The evening's highlight was the unveiling of a new program we were launching, a partnership with dating apps and social media platforms to help identify and prevent romance scams before they could victimize innocent people. As the evening wound down, I found myself back on the hotel's terrace where Jessica and I had talked on my wedding night. This time, I wasn't alone. Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and several other survivors joined me, along with some of the law enforcement officers and legal professionals who'd helped us build the foundation. "Sarah," Patricia said, raising her champagne glass, "I want to make a toast. 1 year ago, you could have quietly called off your wedding, dealt with David and Maya privately, and moved on with your life. Instead, you chose to expose them publicly, connect with their other victims, and build something that would protect other people from going through what we went through. That choice, to turn your personal trauma into a public service, has changed dozens of lives and probably prevented hundreds of people from becoming victims of similar crimes." Jennifer nodded, adding, "You taught us that the best revenge isn't just seeing criminals punished. The best revenge is making sure their crimes ultimately result in more good than harm in the world." Rebecca raised her glass. "To Sarah, who showed us that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the launching pad for the best thing you'll ever do." We clinked glasses as the city sparkled below us, and I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that horrible morning when I discovered David's betrayal. 1 year ago, I'd been a trusting woman planning to marry a man who saw me as nothing more than a source of money to steal. Tonight, I was the founder of a successful nonprofit, a recognized expert in financial fraud prevention, and a leader in the movement to help victims of romantic crimes. 1 year ago, I'd been isolated and devastated. Tonight, I was surrounded by some of the strongest, most inspiring women I'd ever met. Women who'd survived unimaginable betrayals and chosen to transform their pain into power. 1 year ago, I'd thought my life was over. Tonight, I knew it was just beginning. Epilogue, 3 years later. 3 years after the wedding that never was, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address showed it was from the Federal Correctional Facility, where David was serving his sentence. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of me was curious about what he could possibly have to say after all this time. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread. The paper felt thin between my fingers, institutional and impersonal, yet somehow weighted with significance I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. It had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, mixed in with the usual stack of foundation correspondence, donation receipts, and conference invitations that now filled my mailbox. My assistant, Jennifer Huang, not to be confused with Jennifer Patterson, one of David's other victims, had sorted through the mail as she did every morning, but this particular envelope had made her pause. "Sarah," she'd said, holding it out to me with a concerned expression. "This one's personal. From." She glanced at the return address, and her voice had trailed off. Jennifer knew the whole story, of course. Everyone who worked at the foundation did. It was impossible to do this work without understanding intimately why we did it. I'd taken the envelope and carried it to my office, where it sat on my desk for the entire morning while I attended virtual meetings with other victim advocacy organizations, reviewed grant applications, and worked on my keynote speech for the upcoming National Financial Crimes Conference. But my eyes kept drifting to that envelope, that neat handwriting that I recognized despite the years that had passed. During my lunch break, I'd walked to the small park across from our foundation offices. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind that reminded me of the season when everything had fallen apart, when my carefully constructed life had crumbled in a matter of hours. But now, 3 years later, that same seasonal change felt like renewal rather than destruction. I found a bench under a maple tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red, and I finally opened the letter. "Dear Sarah," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me. But I needed to tell you something that I hope will give you some peace. I've had 3 years to think about what I did to you, and to Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the other women Maya and I hurt. I've had 3 years to understand the full scope of the damage we caused, not just financially but emotionally." I paused in my reading, struck by the mention of the other women's names. During the investigation and trial, we'd all become close, bonded by shared trauma, but also by our collective determination to see justice served. Patricia Williams, a retired teacher who'd lost her entire pension to David's schemes. Jennifer Patterson, a young widow who'd been targeted just months after her husband's death. Rebecca Martinez, a successful real estate agent who'd been convinced to invest everything in David's fake development projects. And 7 others, each with their own story of trust betrayed and dreams shattered. I want you to know that you were right about everything. Our relationship was a lie from the beginning. I never loved you. I didn't even understand what love meant. I saw you as a target, a source of money, a means to an end. I was a predator who used your kindness and trust against you. The words should have hurt. 3 years ago, they would have devastated me. But sitting there in the autumn sunlight, reading David's admission of what I'd already come to understand, I felt something closer to relief than pain. There was validation in seeing him acknowledge the truth I'd fought so hard to accept. But I also want you to know that watching what you've built from the wreckage of my crimes has taught me something I never understood before. You took the worst thing I could do to you and turned it into the best thing you could do for other people. You took betrayal and turned it into justice. You took trauma and turned it into triumph. This paragraph made me pause. How did he know about the foundation? How much did he know about what we'd accomplished? I've followed the work of your foundation from prison. I know about the victims you've helped, the criminals you've stopped, the lives you've saved. What you've accomplished is more meaningful than anything I ever built through legitimate means. The idea that David had been following our work from prison was unsettling, but I realized it shouldn't have been surprising. The Saracen Foundation had gained national attention over the past 3 years. We'd been featured in major newspapers, on television news programs, and in documentaries about financial fraud. Our work had garnered awards and recognition from law enforcement agencies, victim rights organizations, and government officials. But knowing that David, the man whose crimes had necessitated our work, was aware of what we'd built felt strange. I wasn't sure if I was uncomfortable with his knowledge or oddly satisfied that he had to witness the positive impact that had grown from his destructive actions. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that if something good had to come from the terrible things Maya and I did, I'm glad it was your foundation. I'm glad our crimes led to something that prevents other people from going through what our victims experienced. Maya. Even now, 3 years later, hearing her name in connection with David's crime still brought a twist of additional pain. Maya Patel had been David's partner in more ways than one. Not just in crime, but in the elaborate deception that had convinced me I'd found the love of my life. She'd played the role of his business partner, his trusted confidant, his platonic friend who'd helped convince me of his legitimacy and good character. Maya had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, 8 fewer than David, because she'd cooperated with prosecutors and provided crucial evidence that helped convict him. She'd also testified about other fraud schemes they'd run before targeting me and the other women, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars for victims across the country. I'd never heard from Maya directly. Unlike David, she'd never attempted to contact me or any of the other victims. Her lawyer had conveyed an apology during her sentencing hearing, but it had felt perfunctory, scripted, designed more to influence her sentence than to express genuine remorse. I have 17 more years to think about the choices I made and the people I hurt. I plan to spend that time trying to find some way to make amends for the damage I caused. I don't know if that's possible, but I have to try. 17 more years. David had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, plus restitution that would likely take him the rest of his life to pay off, if he ever could. The financial damage he and Maya had inflicted extended far beyond what they'd stolen from us directly. Their schemes had involved fake investments, fraudulent business ventures, and complex money laundering operations that had affected dozens of financial institutions and hundreds of innocent people. I hope you found happiness and love with someone who deserves you and would never betray your trust. I hope you know that none of what happened was your fault. You were everything you appeared to be, kind, trusting, generous, and strong. I was the one who was living a lie. This part of the letter struck me as both genuine and calculated. Genuine because it acknowledged what I'd needed to hear, that the fault lay entirely with him, not with me for trusting him. Calculated because it felt designed to elicit a response, to make me think of him as reformed and repentant. But the question about whether I'd found love again was one that had been on my mind frequently in recent months. Over the past 3 years, I had dated several men. There had been Marcus, a fellow attorney who worked in white-collar criminal defense. We'd met at a legal conference and had several months of cautious, careful courtship before realizing we were both too guarded, too careful, too afraid of being hurt again to fully open up to each other. Then there had been James, a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. Our relationship had been built on deep conversations and mutual understanding, but ultimately felt more like an extended therapy session than a romance. James had been kind and patient and completely trustworthy, but there had been no spark, no passion, no sense that we were building something together rather than simply healing from our respective pasts. Most recently, there had been Alex, a documentary filmmaker who'd initially contacted me about featuring the foundation in a film about financial fraud recovery. Our professional relationship had gradually evolved into something personal, and for a few months, I'd thought it might develop into something lasting. Alex was creative, passionate about justice, supportive of my work, and completely different from David in every way that mattered. But ultimately, our relationship had ended when Alex accepted a year-long assignment filming in South America. We discussed the possibility of maintaining a long-distance relationship, but both of us had realized that we weren't quite committed enough to each other to make that sacrifice. The parting had been amicable, even friendly, but it had left me wondering if I'd ever be able to fully trust someone enough to build a life together. Congratulations on building something beautiful from something terrible. You've done more good in 3 years than I did in my entire life before I met you. Sincerely, David Mitchell. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my purse. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. There was something both satisfying and sad about seeing David take full responsibility for his actions while acknowledging the positive impact that had come from exposing his crimes. Walking back to the foundation offices, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been a successful corporate attorney focused primarily on mergers and acquisitions, living in a beautiful downtown condo, planning a wedding to a man I thought I knew, believing my life was perfectly on track. The discovery of David's crimes had shattered that life completely. Not just the romantic relationship, but my entire sense of identity and purpose. I'd taken a leave of absence from my law firm, initially thinking I'd return after a few months of recovery. But as I'd worked with FBI agents and prosecutors to understand the full scope of David and Maya's criminal enterprise, I'd realized that victims of financial fraud faced systemic challenges that went far beyond the immediate theft of their money. The legal system, while ultimately effective at prosecuting criminals, was poorly designed to help victims recover and rebuild. Law enforcement agencies were understaffed and overwhelmed, often unable to provide victims with the support and information they needed. Financial institutions were more focused on protecting themselves from liability than helping customers who'd been defrauded. Most frustrating of all, there were very few resources available to help victims understand how they'd been targeted, how to protect themselves in the future, or how to rebuild their financial and emotional lives after being victimized. That realization had led to the creation of the Sarah Chin Foundation, initially funded by the restitution I'd received from David and Maya's seized assets, along with donations from other victims and grants from various organizations focused on financial crime prevention. But building the foundation had been more challenging than I'd initially anticipated. Starting a nonprofit organization required skills I'd never developed as a corporate attorney. Fundraising, program development, staff management, public speaking, media relations, and community outreach. I'd had to learn how to write grant applications, develop educational curricula, manage volunteers, coordinate with law enforcement agencies, and work with trauma counselors and financial advisors. The first year had been especially difficult. I'd been dealing with my own trauma while trying to help others who were experiencing similar challenges. There had been days when I'd wondered if I was strong enough to continue, if the emotional toll of constantly dealing with stories of betrayal and loss was too much to bear. But gradually, the work had become not just manageable but genuinely fulfilling. Helping other victims recover stolen funds, watching them rebuild their lives and regain their confidence, seeing them transform from victims into advocates. It had given my life a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in corporate law. When I returned to the office that afternoon, Jennifer looked up expectantly. She'd clearly been waiting to hear about the letter. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said, and realized I meant it. "Actually, I think it is." I went to my office and took out the letter again, reading it one more time before placing it in my desk drawer. I decided I wouldn't respond to it. There was nothing I needed to say to David, and I had too much important work to focus on to spend time dwelling on the past. But the letter had stirred up memories and reflections that stayed with me for the rest of the week. That evening, I found myself going through old files and documents from the early days of the foundation, remembering the challenges we'd faced and how much we'd accomplished. By then, 3 years after that devastating wedding day that never was, the Saracen Foundation had helped over 500 victims of financial fraud recover stolen funds and rebuild their lives. We'd partnered with federal law enforcement to shut down 12 major romance scam operations. Our educational programs had reached over 1 million people through social media, workshops, and conferences. But those numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the full scope of what we'd accomplished. Each of those 500 victims represented a complete story of devastation and recovery. There was Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old widow who'd lost her late husband's life insurance to a romance scammer, who'd not only recovered most of her money, but had become one of our most effective volunteer educators. There was Carlos Rodriguez, a small business owner who'd been targeted by an investment fraud scheme, who'd rebuilt his company and now served on our board of directors. There was Amy Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, a young nurse who'd lost her medical school savings to a fake cryptocurrency investment, who'd gone on to complete her education and now worked as a forensic nurse specializing in financial abuse cases. There was Robert Park, a retired military veteran who'd been victimized by a fake charity scam, who'd become a specialist in helping other veterans avoid similar schemes. Each of these people had come to us broken, humiliated, financially devastated, and often isolated from family and friends who didn't understand how they could have been so stupid as to fall for a scam. They'd worked with our counselors, financial advisors, and legal advocates to not just recover their losses, but to rebuild their sense of self-worth and purpose. Many of them had become part of our extended community of survivor advocates, speaking at conferences, mentoring new victims, and working with us to develop better prevention and recovery programs. They'd proven that being victimized by financial fraud didn't have to define or destroy a person. It could become the catalyst for building a stronger, more purposeful life. The educational component of our work had perhaps been even more impactful. Our red flags and recovery workshops had been presented at community centers, senior centers, colleges, and corporate offices across the country. Our online resources had been accessed by millions of people seeking to understand and avoid financial fraud schemes. We developed specialized programs for different types of fraud and different demographic groups. Our romance scam recovery program helped people who'd been victimized by fake online relationships. Our investment fraud prevention workshops taught people how to research investment opportunities and avoid Ponzi schemes and other fraudulent investment vehicles. We'd created specialized resources for seniors who were disproportionately targeted by financial fraudsters, and for recent immigrants who were often unfamiliar with common American fraud schemes. We developed programs for small business owners, military personnel, and college students, all groups that faced particular risks of financial victimization. But perhaps most importantly, we'd created a community of survivors who supported each other and worked together to prevent others from experiencing what we'd been through. This community aspect had evolved organically, but had become the heart of everything we did. Monthly support group meetings had expanded into regional conferences. Online forums had grown into active networks of mutual aid and advocacy. Survivor mentorship programs had developed into sophisticated peer counseling initiatives. The foundation had also become a resource for law enforcement agencies investigating financial crimes. Our database of fraud schemes and victim experiences had helped FBI agents and prosecutors understand and pursue cases more effectively. Our survivor advocates had testified in numerous trials, helping juries understand the real impact of financial crimes on victims' lives. We'd worked with legislative committees to draft stronger laws protecting fraud victims and requiring better disclosure and accountability from financial institutions. We'd consulted with technology companies to develop better systems for detecting and preventing online fraud schemes. The work had transformed not just the lives of the people we'd helped, but my own life as well. I'd discovered skills and passions I'd never known I had. Public speaking, which had terrified me as a corporate attorney, had become one of my strengths. I'd given keynote speeches at national conferences, testified before congressional committees, and appeared on national television programs to discuss financial fraud prevention. Fundraising, which had seemed impossibly daunting when I'd first started the foundation, had become an opportunity to tell stories about the incredible resilience and strength of fraud survivors. Major donors weren't just writing checks. They were becoming part of our extended community, bringing their own resources and connections to support our work. Media relations, which I'd initially approached with deep skepticism, had become a powerful tool for reaching potential victims and educating the public about financial fraud schemes. I'd learned to work with journalists, documentary filmmakers, and podcast hosts to tell stories that were both informative and inspiring. Most surprising of all, I discovered that I had a talent for program development and organizational leadership. Building the foundation from a small victim support group into a nationally recognized organization with dozens of staff members and hundreds of volunteers had required skills I'd never known I possessed. But the work had also changed me in more fundamental ways. The experience with David had made me more cautious, more protective of my heart and my resources, more attuned to red flags and inconsistencies in people's behavior. But it had also made me more compassionate, more understanding of human vulnerability, more aware of the ways that trauma could be transformed into strength and purpose. I'd learned to distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing fear, between protecting myself and closing myself off from all possibility of connection and love. It was a balance I was still working to maintain, especially in my personal relationships. The weekend after receiving David's letter, I drove up to visit Patricia Williams at her home in the mountains about 2 hours north of the city. Patricia had become not just a colleague, but a close friend, someone whose wisdom and perspective had guided me through many difficult decisions over the past 3 years. Patricia lived in a small cabin on several acres of wooded land, a peaceful retreat she'd been able to purchase after recovering most of the pension money David had stolen from her. She'd also received a substantial settlement from the school district where she'd worked, which had failed to properly protect her retirement account from fraudulent transactions. "I got your message about the letter," Patricia said as we sat on her porch with cups of coffee, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees. "How are you feeling about it?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me feels like it's manipulative, like he's trying to make me feel sorry for him or think of him as reformed. But part of me thinks it might be genuine." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. She'd been a high school counselor for 30 years before retiring, and she had an uncanny ability to understand people's motivations and emotions. "Does it matter if it's genuine?" she asked. "I mean, does it change anything about your life or your work or your healing if David is truly repentant versus just trying to make himself feel better?" "I guess not," I said. "I mean, I'm not planning to respond to him or have any further contact with him. And nothing he says can undo what he did or change the fact that his crimes led to the foundation and all the good work we've been able to do." "Exactly," Patricia said. "You know what I think? I think David is irrelevant now. He was the catalyst for everything you've built, but you're the one who built it. You're the one who chose to transform trauma into purpose, who chose to help other people instead of just wallowing in victimhood." Patricia paused to take a sip of her coffee, then continued. "When I first met you, right after everything fell apart, you were so angry and hurt and focused on David and Maya and what they'd done to us. That was natural and necessary at the time. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being defined by what they did to you and started being defined by what you chose to do in response. When do you think that shift happened?" I asked. Patricia smiled. "I think it was gradual, but if I had to pick a moment, it would be the day you decided to use your restitution money to start the foundation instead of just keeping it for yourself. That was when you stopped being David Mitchell's victim and started being Sarah Chun, advocate and leader." That conversation with Patricia stayed with me for weeks afterward. She was right that my identity had shifted over the past 3 years, but I hadn't fully appreciated how complete that transformation had been until she pointed it out. 3 years ago, I'd been successful and accomplished, but my sense of self had been largely tied to external validation: my salary, my title, my expensive condo, my prestigious law firm, my handsome fiance. When those external markers had been stripped away by David's betrayal, I'd felt lost and worthless. But building the foundation had taught me that my value came from what I contributed to the world, not from what I accumulated or achieved for myself. The work we'd done had given me a sense of purpose and fulfillment that was deeper and more sustainable than anything I'd experienced in my corporate career. I'd also learned that true strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from surviving it and choosing to remain open to connection despite the risks. Working with hundreds of fraud survivors had shown me that resilience wasn't about being tough enough to never get hurt. It was about being brave enough to heal and trust and love again after being hurt. This lesson had been reinforced through my friendships with the other original fraud victims. Jennifer Patterson had remarried 2 years ago to a man she'd met through a support group for widowed people. Rebecca Martinez had started a new relationship with a fellow real estate agent who understood and supported her advocacy work. Even Patricia, who was in her 70s, had begun dating a retired teacher she'd met through a volunteer literacy program. All of us had learned that being careful didn't have to mean being closed off, and that protecting yourself didn't mean you had to stop trusting everyone. But I was still working on applying that lesson to my own romantic life. The relationships I'd had over the past 3 years had all been with good, trustworthy men, but I'd consistently held back from full commitment. Part of it was practical. The foundation required enormous amounts of time and energy, and I wasn't sure I could balance a serious relationship with the demands of the work. But part of it was also fear. Not fear of being financially defrauded again. I was far too knowledgeable about financial crimes to fall for those schemes now. Rather, it was fear of the emotional vulnerability that came with truly loving someone, fear of the potential for betrayal and loss that was inherent in any deep relationship. This internal struggle had become more pressing in recent months, particularly after Alex had moved to South America. I'd realized that I'd let a good man go partly because I was afraid to commit to him fully, afraid to take the emotional risks that real love required. I'd been discussing this pattern in therapy with Dr. Rachel Morrison, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and who had become an important part of my healing journey. Dr. Morrison had helped me understand that my caution in relationships was a natural and healthy response to what I'd experienced with David, but that it could become problematic if it prevented me from forming the meaningful connections I desired. Healing from betrayal trauma doesn't mean returning to your pre-trauma level of trust, Dr. Morrison had explained during one of our sessions. It means developing a more sophisticated understanding of trustworthiness, better skills for assessing people's character and intentions, and the ability to build trust gradually over time rather than jumping in immediately. But it also means maintaining your capacity for deep connection and intimacy, she'd continued. If your self-protection becomes so complete that you can't form close relationships, then the trauma has won. The goal is informed trust, not permanent isolation. These conversations with Dr. Morrison had helped me understand that my romantic caution wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved, but rather a skill to be refined. I was learning to distinguish between reasonable prudence and paralyzing fear, between protective boundaries and defensive walls. This personal growth had coincided with the foundation reaching a new level of stability and success. After 3 years of intense growth and development, we'd established sustainable funding streams, built strong partnerships with law enforcement and other organizations, and developed systems and programs that could operate effectively without my constant direct involvement. That stability had created space for me to think about what I wanted for the next phase of my life. The foundation would always be important to me, but I was no longer needed to manage every detail personally. I could hire additional staff, delegate more responsibilities, and create time for other priorities and interests. One of those priorities had become writing. Over the past year, I'd been working on a book about financial fraud recovery, drawing on my own experience and the stories of hundreds of survivors I'd worked with through the foundation. The book was intended to be both a practical guide for fraud victims and an educational resource for professionals who worked with them. Writing the book had been emotionally challenging, requiring me to revisit and process aspects of my experience with David that I'd avoided thinking about for years. But it had also been deeply satisfying, providing a way to reach even more people who might benefit from understanding both how financial fraud worked and how recovery was possible. The book had also led to opportunities for speaking engagements, consulting work, and media appearances that went beyond the Foundation's direct services. Publishers and conference organizers were interested in my perspective not just as an advocate, but as someone who had personally experienced and overcome financial fraud victimization. This expanding platform had made me think about other ways I might use my experience and expertise to create positive change. I'd been invited to serve on the boards of several other nonprofit organizations. Universities had approached me about teaching courses on financial crime and victim advocacy. Government agencies had asked me to consult on policy development. All of these opportunities were exciting and meaningful, but they also represented choices about how to use my time and energy most effectively. I was learning that success created its own challenges, not just the practical challenge of managing multiple commitments, but the deeper challenge of staying focused on the work that mattered most. These reflections on purpose and priorities had been much on my mind as the 4th anniversary of the wedding that never was approached. I decided to mark the occasion by hosting a private dinner for the original fraud survivors: Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the others who'd been victimized by David and Maya. We'd done similar gatherings each year, but this one felt particularly significant. I'd reserved a private dining room at a restaurant downtown, the same neighborhood where I'd lived when I was engaged to David, though in a building that held no memories of that time in my life. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, returning to the scene of my former life, but as a completely transformed person surrounded by people who understood and shared my journey. Patricia arrived first, looking elegant in a navy dress and carrying a bottle of champagne she'd brought for the occasion. She'd driven down from her mountain home specifically for the dinner, and her presence always brought a sense of wisdom and perspective to our gatherings. Jennifer Patterson came next, accompanied by her husband Tom, whom she'd married 2 years earlier. Tom was a quiet, kind man who worked as a grief counselor and who understood Jennifer's trauma history without being intimidated by it. Their relationship had been a source of inspiration for all of us, proof that it was possible to find love and trust again after devastating betrayal. Rebecca Martinez arrived with her partner Maria, whom she'd been dating for about a year. Rebecca had discovered during her recovery process that her previous focus on relationships with men had been partly motivated by social expectations rather than authentic attraction. Coming out as a lesbian at age 45 had been another aspect of her journey toward living authentically, and Maria had been wonderfully supportive of Rebecca's advocacy work with the foundation. The other survivors arrived in pairs and individually, each bringing their own updates and stories from the year that had passed. Carmen Rodriguez had completed her master's degree in social work and started a job with a county agency that worked with elder abuse victims. Michael Thompson had published a series of articles about investment fraud in a financial planning magazine. Lisa Park had started a support group for fraud survivors in her hometown, modeled on the programs we developed at the foundation. As we settled around the table and ordered our meals, I felt the familiar warmth and connection that characterized our annual gatherings. These people weren't just colleagues or fellow survivors. They were family, bound together by shared experience and mutual support through one of the most difficult periods of our lives. Before we start catching up on everything that's happened this year, I said, raising my water glass, I want to thank all of you for being here and for continuing to be part of this incredible community we've built together. Actually, Patricia interjected with a smile, before we do the toasts, I have an announcement to make. She glanced around the table with barely contained excitement. Bill and I are getting married next month. The table erupted in cheers and congratulations. Bill was the retired teacher Patricia had been dating for the past year, and all of us had met him at various foundation events. He was a gentle, thoughtful man who clearly adored Patricia and who had embraced her advocacy work as part of accepting her into his life. That's wonderful news, Jennifer exclaimed. When did he propose? Last week, Patricia said, beaming. We were hiking on the trail behind my cabin, and he got down on one knee right at the overlook where you can see the whole valley. It was perfect, nothing fancy or elaborate, just honest and real and exactly what I wanted. As Patricia shared the details of her engagement and their wedding plans, I found myself thinking about how much her life had changed since David's crimes had brought us all together. For years ago, she'd been a recently retired teacher, looking forward to a quiet retirement funded by the pension she'd worked 30 years to build. David's theft of that pension had initially seemed like the end of her financial security and independence. But the recovery of her stolen money, combined with the settlement from her former employer and her part-time consulting work with the foundation, had actually left Patricia in better financial shape than she'd expected. More importantly, her advocacy work had given her a sense of purpose and community that made her retirement years far more fulfilling than she'd originally planned. And now, at 73, she was embarking on a new marriage with someone who shared her values and supported her passions. It was a beautiful example of how life could surprise you with unexpected gifts, even after devastating losses. You know what the best part is? Patricia said as we raised our glasses in a toast to her engagement. Bill understands exactly why this work matters to me, because he's seen what we've accomplished together. He's not threatened by my past or by the time I spend on the foundation. He's proud of what we've built and wants to be part of supporting it. That's how you know he's the right person, Rebecca said. Someone who embraces the work that's meaningful to you instead of competing with it or trying to minimize it. Jennifer nodded in agreement. Tom felt the same way when we were getting serious. He said that watching me help other fraud survivors had shown him how strong and compassionate I was, and that those were the qualities that made him fall in love with me. As the evening progressed and we shared updates on our personal lives and professional work, I realized how much all of our lives had been transformed over the past 4 years. Each person at the table had taken the devastation David and Maya had caused and turned it into something positive. Not just recovery, but growth, purpose, and meaningful contribution to protecting others. Carmen had used her experience to build a career helping vulnerable adults avoid financial exploitation. Michael had become an expert in investment fraud prevention, publishing articles and speaking at conferences. Lisa had created support networks in her rural community where resources for fraud survivors had been virtually non-existent. All of us had become educators, advocates, and mentors, using our painful experiences to help others avoid similar victimization or recover more effectively when fraud did occur. We'd transformed from victims into experts, from targets into protectors. You know what I realized today? I said as we were finishing our desserts. David and Maya thought they were so smart, so sophisticated, such brilliant criminals. But in the end, all they did was bring together a group of people who became each other's strength and went on to protect hundreds of other people from criminals just like them. Jennifer laughed. They created their own worst nightmare, a network of educated, motivated people who understood their methods and were determined to stop them. Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. Every person we've helped, every scam we've prevented, every criminal we've helped catch, it's all because David and Maya were stupid enough to target Sarah. They created their own downfall. Patricia raised her wine glass again. To unintended consequences, she said with a grin. May all criminals be so foolish as to target people who will turn their crimes into forces for justice. As we talked and laughed and shared stories of the work we'd done and the lives we'd saved, I realized that the woman who'd stood at the altar 4 years ago, naive, trusting, ready to bind her life to someone she didn't really know, had been completely transformed. I was stronger, wiser, more purposeful, and more connected to meaningful work than I'd ever been. I'd built something lasting and important from the ashes of betrayal. I'd turned the worst experience of my life into the foundation for the most rewarding work I'd ever done. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving trauma. It was about choosing to remain open to love, trust, and connection despite having been hurt. It was about protecting yourself without closing yourself off, about learning from experience without becoming cynical or bitter. Looking around the table at these remarkable people who had become my chosen family, I understood that David and Maya had tried to destroy us, steal from us, and leave us broken and humiliated. Instead, they'd given us the opportunity to become exactly who we were meant to be. They'd brought us together, given us a shared mission, and created the circumstances that allowed us to discover our own strength, resilience, and capacity for making a positive difference in the world. And that, I realized, was the ultimate revenge, not just surviving what they'd done to us, but thriving in ways they could never have imagined, building something beautiful and meaningful from the wreckage of their crimes, and ensuring that their destructive actions ultimately led to protecting countless others from experiencing what we'd been through. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave the restaurant, Patricia pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about David's letter," she said quietly. "I hope you realize that his acknowledgement of what you've accomplished doesn't give him any credit for it. He was the tornado that destroyed your house. You're the one who chose to build something better on the same foundation." Walking home through the downtown streets where I'd once planned a future with David, I reflected on Patricia's words and on everything we'd discussed that evening. The letter from David, which had seemed so significant when I'd received it a few weeks earlier, now felt like a minor footnote to the story of what we'd all accomplished. David and Maya were serving their sentences, isolated from society and each other, cut off from the lives they'd destroyed and the positive changes that had grown from their crimes. They would spend years in prison, and when they were finally released, they would face the challenge of rebuilding their lives with criminal records, damaged reputations, and the weight of their victims' stories following them wherever they went. Meanwhile, we had built something extraordinary. The foundation had evolved into a nationally recognized organization that served as a model for victim advocacy programs across the country. Our educational materials were used by law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and community organizations from coast to coast. Our survivor advocacy program had been replicated in 12 other cities, creating a network of support and protection that reached thousands of people. But beyond the statistics and the recognition, we'd created something even more valuable: a community of people who had transformed their worst experiences into their greatest contributions. We'd proven that victims could become advocates, that trauma could become wisdom, and that the worst human impulses toward greed and deception could ultimately serve the best human impulses toward justice and protection. The months following that anniversary dinner brought several significant developments in both my personal and professional life. The book I'd been working on was accepted for publication by a major publishing house, with a release date scheduled for the following year. The publisher was planning a substantial marketing campaign, including a national book tour and appearances on major television programs. Writing the book had required me to delve deeply into not just my own experience, but the experiences of dozens of other fraud survivors. I'd interviewed victims of romance scams, investment fraud, charity scams, and numerous other financial crimes. Their stories had reinforced my understanding of how these crimes worked and how recovery was possible, but they'd also revealed new insights about the psychological and social factors that made people vulnerable to fraud. One of the most important revelations had been that financial fraud victims came from every demographic group and every level of education and sophistication. The stereotype of fraud victims as gullible, greedy, or foolish was not only incorrect but actively harmful, because it prevented people from recognizing their own vulnerability and seeking help when they needed it. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, business owners, and retirees had all fallen victim to sophisticated fraud schemes. The common factor wasn't stupidity or greed, but rather normal human psychology: the desire for love, the hope for financial security, the trust in apparent authority figures, and the tendency to make decisions based on emotion rather than careful analysis when we were stressed, lonely, or facing major life transitions. Understanding these psychological vulnerabilities had helped me develop more effective prevention programs and more compassionate approaches to helping victims recover. It had also helped me understand my own experience with David more clearly and release the last vestiges of self-blame and shame that had lingered despite years of therapy and advocacy work. The book project had also led to unexpected opportunities for collaboration with researchers, policymakers, and other advocates working on financial crime prevention. I'd been invited to contribute to academic studies on fraud recovery, to testify at legislative hearings on consumer protection, and to serve on advisory committees for several government agencies. These opportunities were exciting, but they also forced me to make difficult decisions about how to allocate my time and energy. The foundation was thriving, but it still required significant leadership and oversight. The book tour and related promotional activities would take me away from the day-to-day work with survivors that remained the most personally meaningful aspect of my career. After extensive discussions with my staff and board of directors, we decided to use the book's publication and the media attention it would generate as an opportunity to expand the foundation's impact and financial sustainability. We launched a major fundraising campaign tied to the book's release, with the goal of doubling our annual budget and expanding our services to reach victims in underserved rural and urban areas. The campaign was more successful than we'd dared to hope. Major foundations, corporate sponsors, and individual donors responded enthusiastically to our message about transforming trauma into advocacy. Within 6 months, we'd not only met our fundraising goal but exceeded it by nearly 50%. This financial success allowed us to hire additional staff, expand our educational programs, and launch new initiatives that had been on our wish list for years. We created a legal clinic that provided free representation to fraud victims seeking to recover stolen assets. We developed a financial literacy program specifically designed for people recovering from financial crimes. We established a research division that studied emerging fraud trends and developed new prevention strategies. Perhaps most significantly, we launched the Survivor Leadership Institute, a program that provided intensive training for fraud victims who wanted to become professional advocates or start their own victim support organizations. The institute drew participants from across the country and even internationally, creating a network of trained advocates who could provide support and services in communities where none had existed before. The success of these programs was deeply satisfying, but it also highlighted a personal challenge I was facing. As the foundation grew and received more recognition, I was increasingly seen as the face and voice of the organization. Media interviews, speaking engagements, and fundraising events all focused on my personal story and my role as the founder. While I understood the practical reasons for this focus, donors and audiences connected with personal narratives more than abstract statistics. I was uncomfortable with the level of personal attention and the way it seemed to minimize the contributions of the many other survivors who had built the foundation alongside me. This concern led to extensive discussions with Patricia, Jennifer, Rebecca, and the other founding members about how to ensure that the foundation's growth didn't overshadow the collaborative, survivor-centered approach that had always been central to our work. We decided to restructure the organization's leadership to better reflect the collective nature of our efforts. I would remain as executive director and the primary public spokesperson, but we created a survivor advisory council that would have significant input on all programmatic and strategic decisions. We also established a speakers bureau that included multiple survivor advocates, ensuring that our educational programs and media appearances weren't dependent solely on my availability and perspective. These organizational changes were implemented just as I was beginning to travel for book promotion events. The timing was fortuitous, because it allowed me to test the foundation's ability to operate effectively in my absence, while also providing opportunities to promote our work to new audiences across the country. The book tour took me to over 30 cities in 3 months, including appearances on national television programs, radio shows, and podcasts. Each event was an opportunity to educate audiences about financial fraud prevention and to encourage victims to seek help rather than suffering in silence. But the tour also provided unexpected personal insights. Traveling alone for extended periods, staying in hotels, and spending long hours in airports and on airplanes gave me time for reflection and introspection that had been rare during the intense, community-focused years of building the foundation. I found myself thinking about the relationships I'd walked away from over the past few years, wondering if my dedication to the foundation had become an excuse for avoiding the vulnerability that deep personal connections required. I thought about Alex, who had sent me postcards from South America, but with whom I'd maintained only superficial contact since he'd left. During a particularly long flight delay in Chicago, I impulsively decided to write Alex a letter, an actual handwritten letter on hotel stationery. I told him about the book, about the foundation's growth, and about how much I'd learned about myself during the months we'd dated. I admitted that I'd let him go partly because I'd been afraid of the commitment that a serious relationship would require, and I apologized for not being more honest about my fears at the time. I didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, I carried it with me for the rest of the tour, adding to it periodically when thoughts or feelings arose that I wanted to share. By the time I returned home, the letter had become less about Alex specifically and more about my own journey toward understanding what I wanted in a romantic relationship and what I was willing to risk to find it. I never did send that letter to Alex, but writing it had helped me clarify my thoughts and feelings about love, trust, and vulnerability in ways that months of therapy sessions hadn't achieved. I realized that my caution about relationships wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved, but it could become a barrier to the kind of deep connection I ultimately desired if I let it prevent me from taking reasonable emotional risks. This insight proved relevant sooner than I'd expected. During one of my final book tour appearances, at a conference on financial crime prevention in Seattle, I met Dr. Michael Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, a criminology professor who had been researching financial fraud trends for over a decade. Michael had attended my keynote presentation and approached me afterward with thoughtful questions about the foundation's work and insights about how our practical experience complemented his academic research. Our conversation continued over coffee, then dinner, and eventually extended to a long walk through downtown Seattle. There was something immediately comfortable about talking with Michael. He understood the work I did not just intellectually but emotionally, having interviewed hundreds of crime victims in his research. He was also familiar with the challenges of balancing meaningful work with personal relationships, having gone through his own divorce several years earlier when his academic career had consumed too much of his time and attention. Most importantly, Michael seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, not just as the founder of a successful organization or the author of a book about fraud recovery. He asked about my interests outside of work, my thoughts about living in different cities, my experiences traveling for the book tour. When I mentioned that I was planning to extend my stay in Seattle for a few extra days to explore the city, Michael offered to serve as a local guide. I accepted his offer, and we spent 2 wonderful days hiking in the mountains, visiting museums and bookstores, and talking about everything from criminology research to favorite novels to childhood memories. By the time I returned home, we'd exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for him to visit the foundation when he was next on the East Coast for a conference. I found myself looking forward to seeing him again in a way that felt both exciting and slightly terrifying. Over the following months, Michael and I maintained regular contact through phone calls, emails, and video chats. He was working on a book of his own about white-collar crime prevention, and we often discussed our respective writing projects and shared drafts of chapters for feedback. When Michael did visit the East Coast for a conference 3 months later, our reunion was even better than I'd hoped. He was genuinely interested in touring the foundation offices, meeting the staff, and understanding the day-to-day operations of our programs. He asked informed questions about our survivor advocacy model and offered thoughtful suggestions based on his research experience. But he was equally interested in spending time with me outside of work. We drove to Patricia's mountain cabin for a weekend visit, during which Patricia and Bill both clearly approved of him. We spent an evening with Jennifer and Tom, exploring the city's restaurant scene and attending a concert at the Symphony. Most significantly, Michael seemed completely comfortable with the intensity and visibility of my work. He understood why I received calls from survivors at odd hours, why I sometimes had to cancel personal plans for foundation emergencies, and why media interviews and speaking engagements were an important part of my professional responsibilities. "I knew what I was getting into when I met you," he said when I apologized for having to reschedule one of our planned dates due to a crisis at the foundation. "Your work isn't separate from who you are. It's an expression of your values and your strength. I wouldn't want you to be someone who could just set that aside." This level of understanding and support was something I'd never experienced in a romantic relationship. Marcus, James, and Alex had all been good men who'd tried to be supportive of my work, but none of them had truly understood why it meant so much to me or how it had shaped my identity and priorities. Michael's acceptance of my work and his enthusiasm for the Foundation's mission made it easier for me to be open about other aspects of my life and my concerns about relationships. I told him about David's letter and how it had made me reflect on my journey from victim to advocate. I shared my worries about whether I was capable of the kind of vulnerability that a serious relationship required. "You know what I think?" Michael said during one of our long phone conversations. "I think you've already demonstrated incredible vulnerability by building the foundation and becoming a public advocate. You've shared your most painful experience with thousands of people. You've opened yourself to criticism and judgment, and you've made your personal trauma the foundation for helping others. That takes enormous courage." "But that's different," I protested. "Professional vulnerability isn't the same as personal vulnerability." "Isn't it?" Michael asked. "When you speak at conferences about what David did to you, when you counsel other fraud victims, when you share your story in interviews, that's deeply personal. You're trusting audiences and readers and clients with the most painful details of your life. You're making yourself vulnerable to their judgment, their questions, their responses." I had never thought about my advocacy work in those terms, but Michael's perspective helped me understand that I had been practicing vulnerability for years, just in a different context. The skills I'd developed for sharing my story publicly, for trusting other survivors with my experiences, and for remaining open to helping people despite the emotional cost. Those same skills could be applied to intimate relationships. This realization marked a turning point in my relationship with Michael and in my understanding of my own capacity for romantic connection. Over the course of several months, as we navigated the challenges of a long-distance relationship and planned visits around our respective travel schedules, I found myself gradually relaxing into a level of trust and intimacy that I hadn't experienced since before David's betrayal. Michael's academic schedule and research commitments meant that he understood the demands of meaningful work in ways that complemented rather than competed with my foundation responsibilities. When he was deep into writing or analyzing data, he appreciated that I had my own intensive work periods. When I was traveling for speaking engagements or dealing with foundation crises, he was supportive without being intrusive. But we also made time for the kind of personal connection that had been missing from my life for years. We took weekend trips to explore new cities, spent quiet evenings cooking dinner and talking about books, and gradually developed the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from truly knowing and being known by another person. The relationship progressed naturally, without the pressure or anxiety that had characterized my previous attempts at dating. I found myself looking forward to Michael's visits and calls, missing him when we were apart, and imagining what it might be like to build a life together. This shift in my personal life coincided with the 5th anniversary of the wedding that never was, a milestone that felt more like a celebration than a memorial. The foundation was thriving, my book had become a bestseller, and I was in a healthy, supportive relationship with someone who understood and valued my work. For the 5th anniversary dinner, we decided to expand beyond the original victim group to include some of the foundation staff, board members, and survivor advocates who had become central to our extended community. The gathering was held at a larger venue, with nearly 50 people in attendance. Patricia and Bill, now married for over a year, served as informal hosts for the event. Jennifer and Tom announced that they were expecting their first child, a pregnancy that had taken several years to achieve and that represented a triumph of hope over fear for Jennifer, who had worried that her trauma history would prevent her from being a good mother. Rebecca and Maria had moved in together and were planning to start a family of their own through adoption. Carmen had been promoted to supervise her county's elder abuse prevention program. Michael Thompson had been elected to his town's city council, where he was advocating for stronger consumer protection ordinances. Lisa Park's Rural Support Group had grown into a regional organization that served several counties, providing services that had never been available in that area before. Each of the original survivors had not only rebuilt their own lives, but had created positive impacts that extended far beyond their personal recovery. As I looked around the room at these remarkable people, survivors, advocates, staff members, board members, and supporters who had all become part of our extended family, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought us together. Michael, who had traveled from Seattle specifically to attend the anniversary dinner, sat beside me during the evening's presentations and toasts. Having him there felt significant, not just because I wanted him to meet this important community, but because his presence represented my own growth toward trusting someone enough to include them in the most meaningful aspects of my life. During the formal program, I gave a speech reflecting on the 5 years that had passed since David's crimes had brought us all together. I talked about the evolution from individual trauma to collective advocacy, from victim support to crime prevention, from local organization to national movement. But I also spoke about the personal transformation that each of us had experienced, not just recovery from what had been done to us, but growth into who we were meant to become. I talked about the difference between surviving trauma and thriving despite it, between protecting ourselves and closing ourselves off from love and connection. 5 years ago, David Mitchell and Maya Patel thought they were very clever, I said, looking out at the faces of people who had become my chosen family. They thought they had found the perfect victims, trusting, generous people who would be easy to deceive and too ashamed to fight back when we discovered their crimes. They were wrong about everything except our generosity and trust. But those qualities weren't weaknesses that made us vulnerable to exploitation. They were strengths that enabled us to transform victimization into advocacy, trauma into wisdom, and personal pain into public purpose. David and Maya took money from us, but we've helped hundreds of other people recover millions of dollars in stolen assets. They tried to destroy our ability to trust, but we've created a community built on mutual support and understanding. They attempted to leave us isolated and ashamed, but we've built a network that spans the country and reaches thousands of people. Most importantly, they tried to make us smaller, less trusting, less generous, less willing to open our hearts to other people. Instead, we've become larger, more compassionate, more resilient, more committed to protecting others from the kind of pain we experienced. That transformation wasn't automatic or inevitable. Each of us made choices, day after day, to focus on healing rather than bitterness, on helping others rather than just protecting ourselves, on building something positive rather than just recovering what we'd lost. Tonight, as we celebrate 5 years of the work we've built together, I want to acknowledge that our greatest victory isn't the foundation we've created or the recognition we've received or the people we've helped, though all of those things matter enormously. Our greatest victory is that we refuse to let the worst thing that happened to us define who we became. We refuse to let David and Maya's crimes make us smaller, meaner, or more afraid. We chose to remain open to love, to trust, and to connection, even after being betrayed. We chose to use our pain to prevent other people's pain, and our trauma to create other people's healing. And that choice, to remain generous and trusting and committed to making the world better despite having been hurt, that's the choice that transforms victims into survivors, and survivors into advocates, and advocates into agents of lasting change. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Michael helped me clean up and load leftover food and supplies into my car. The practical support felt as meaningful as the emotional support. Having someone who was willing to do the mundane work of community building alongside the more visible work of public advocacy. "Thank you for including me tonight," Michael said as we drove home. "I feel honored to meet the people who've been so important to your journey and to understand better how much you've all accomplished together." "Thank you for being here," I replied. "It means a lot to have you meet everyone and see this part of my life." "I hope you know how remarkable you are," Michael said quietly. "Not just what you've built professionally, but who you've become as a person. The way you've transformed trauma into purpose, the way you've remained open to love and trust despite being betrayed, it's extraordinary." That conversation marked another milestone in our relationship and in my own personal growth. For the first time since David's betrayal, I was able to receive love and admiration from someone whose judgment I trusted. Someone who knew my full story and chose to be with me not despite my experiences, but because of how I'd responded to them. Over the following months, Michael and I began having serious conversations about the future. He was eligible for a sabbatical year that would allow him to relocate temporarily, and we discussed the possibility of him spending that year on the East Coast, working on his book while also contributing to the Foundation's research initiatives. The prospect of living in the same city, of building a shared daily life rather than managing a long-distance relationship, was both exciting and slightly terrifying. But I was ready for that challenge in ways I wouldn't have been even a year earlier. My relationship with Michael had taught me that trusting someone didn't require ignoring red flags or accepting unacceptable behavior. Instead, it meant carefully observing someone's actions over time, noting the consistency between their words and their behavior, and making gradual decisions to become more vulnerable based on evidence of their trustworthiness. Michael had proven his trustworthiness in small ways and large ones. By respecting my boundaries, supporting my work, integrating well with my community, and demonstrating the kind of character and integrity that made deeper commitment feel safe rather than scary. As I reflected on the journey from David's betrayal to Michael's love, I realized that the Foundation's work had been not just about helping other people recover from fraud, but about my own recovery and growth. Every survivor I'd counseled, every educational program I'd developed, every speech I'd given had been part of my own healing process. The work had taught me that resilience wasn't about avoiding future pain, but about developing the skills and support systems necessary to handle whatever challenges might arise. It had shown me that trust wasn't about believing that people would never hurt or disappoint me, but about choosing to remain open to connection while protecting myself appropriately. Most importantly, the Foundation had demonstrated that even the most devastating experiences could be transformed into sources of strength, wisdom, and positive impact. David and Maya's crimes had been intended to destroy and diminish their victims, but they had instead created the circumstances for unprecedented personal growth and meaningful contribution. On the morning of what would have been my wedding day 6 years earlier, I woke up in Michael's arms in the apartment we now shared, surrounded by the life we were building together. The Foundation was more successful than I'd ever imagined possible. My book was being translated into multiple languages, and I was in the healthiest, most supportive relationship of my life. But perhaps most significantly, I had become someone I genuinely admired. Someone who had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into the best work she had ever done. Someone who had chosen love and trust and generosity despite being betrayed. Someone who had refused to let trauma make her smaller or meaner or more afraid. David Mitchell and Maya Patel had tried to destroy me, steal from me, and leave me broken and humiliated. Instead, they had given me the opportunity to become exactly who I was meant to be, a person whose life was defined not by what had been done to me, but by what I had chosen to do in response. They had intended to make me a victim, but they had actually made me an advocate. They had tried to steal my future, but they had instead given me a purpose more meaningful than any I could have imagined. And that, I knew with absolute certainty, was the ultimate revenge, not just surviving their crimes, but transforming them into the foundation for a life of meaning. love, and lasting positive impact that would continue long after their sentences were served and their names were forgotten. The woman who had stood at the altar 6 years ago, ready to bind her life to someone she didn't truly know, was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, more purposeful, and more capable of both giving and receiving authentic love. And for that transformation, as painful as the journey had been, I was ultimately grateful. Thanks for your amazing listening time. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button, like and share this video, and the channel till the next video. Thank you.